week or two ago, I went on the long trail into the dense forest outside my town. I lived in a small village of just under 1,000 people, so we were pretty far away from the big cities. The forest on the outskirts was relatively flat, with no mountains or hills, but there were a few ponds and small rivers in the center of it. One of those rivers was my destination. I had been there several times before, but had never camped there until this day. Remembering my previous visits, I estimated that it was about 3 hours walk away, almost as far north as I could go. As I walked among the trees, the atmosphere was peaceful, interrupted only by the sounds of birds and other wildlife rustling the leaves. There were no people or hikers, which is not surprising since this is not an official trail, just open forest. However, about a 45-minute walk from the river, I unexpectedly met a man. We were both walking towards each other, and neither of us seemed to notice the other until we were a few feet apart, separated only by a couple of trees. I must have looked confused and a little nervous about the unexpected encounter, thinking it was unusual to meet someone off the trail in the middle of this forest. But the man had the same look on his face. Just as I was about to break the silence and say hello, the man's expression changed to a slight nervous smile, and he turned to leave. I followed his example and continued walking, but after moving some distance away, I couldn't help but look back. To my surprise, the man was no longer walking, but almost running, without saying a word. This encounter discouraged me somewhat, but to see him running was even stranger. He didn't seem to want to be seen, or he didn't care about this unlikely chance encounter. Whatever the case, I was left to my own devices and headed towards the river. Since there was no designated camping spot, I pitched my tent on the flattest spot I could find and started a fire as the sun began to set. Several hours passed as I sat by the fire and waited for the stars to appear. Suddenly I heard distinct footsteps behind me, slow and purposeful. I turned and shined my flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, but the uneasy feeling returned. I called out, but there was no answer. After a moment's hesitation, I cautiously made my way toward where I had heard the sound. Moving through the woods, I illuminated the area with a flashlight until I saw the same man I had encountered earlier, standing motionless only 20 feet away from me. I pretended not to notice him and continued on my way, trying to keep my composure. Back at the tent, I quickly gathered my belongings, left the fire, and headed into the woods along the riverbank. Feeling that I was at a safe distance, I ran until I was sure I was far away from the man. Finding a place to rest, I stayed up until dawn, glad I hadn't met him again. I never returned to my tent, fearing what I might find there. I traveled in my SUV to the woods located a few miles from my house. I live in a rural area with lots of surrounding woods, so camping is pretty common around here. The place I arrived at was little known, just a campground big enough for several RVs. I liked that it was rarely crowded, and the access road was wide enough for my RV. When I arrived, the grassy field where I parked was empty. With no specific plans, I sat inside for a while before setting up the tent with awning. I then gathered wood for a fire, wanting to be ready for nightfall. After heading into the woods behind the van to gather dry firewood, I was gone for about 20 minutes. When I returned, I found a man setting up a tent nearby. We exchanged nods of greeting, and I didn't think much of it, except that I was a little disappointed that we had to share territory. After sitting in my van for a while, I noticed that the man had finished putting up the tent. It looked shabby and barely usable, with holes and flaps fluttering in the wind. Looking around, I didn't spot the man nearby. Leaving my van, I built a fire, pondering the strangeness of my choice of tent. As darkness fell, I stayed by the fire, feeling increasingly curious about the man's whereabouts. Several hours passed, and as the night grew deeper, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to check the man's tent and called out to him, but received no response. As I looked around the dark forest, I noticed a figure by a tree, motionless and barely recognizable. Fear gripped me as I realized it might not be the man from the tent. I retreated to my van, watching the figure from the window. After a moment's hesitation, I drove away, haunted by the unknown of who or what was lurking in the woods. About 2 years ago, I was living with my younger brother on the East Coast. We spent a lot of time with friends and at restaurants, but didn't often get out for interesting activities. Feeling a little restless, I thought of camping as a potential adventure, given our proximity to the Appalachian Mountains. Excited, I shared the idea with my brother, but he didn't share my enthusiasm. Undeterred, I decided to go hiking alone. With minimal experience, this probably wasn't the wisest decision, but I figured a short, one-night camping trip wouldn't pose much of a risk. After buying everything I needed for the hike, I gathered my gear and headed to the nearest trailhead. The area seemed deserted, no parked cars, no signs of fellow hikers. Without giving up hope, I set off down the trail, which looked abandoned and overgrown. Despite the difficult terrain, I eventually reached the end of the trail and found a small, somewhat abandoned campground. Nearby, I noticed a pile of logs, indicating recent use. Despite the lack of other campers, I decided to pitch my tent. As dusk fell, I heard the crackling of a campfire nearby. Stepping outside, I found a man sitting across from me, near the half-burned logs. He seemed harmless enough, and we exchanged nods of greeting. But his presence alerted me, especially since I had not noticed his appearance. There was no sign of his tent or gear, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Despite my discomfort, I built a small fire and tried to relax. As darkness fell, my anxiety increased. I kept my eyes on the man sitting at the other end of the campsite, wondering where he had come from and why he seemed so secluded. Eventually, I retreated to my tent, hoping to get rid of my anxiety and get some rest. But sleep eluded me. The crackling of the man's fire echoed in the darkness, and I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. My anxiety increased when I heard footsteps approaching my tent. Frozen with fear, I watched as a shadowy figure loomed outside. Terrified, I waited until it disappeared into the night, then hastily packed my things and left. To this day, I am haunted by the mystery of the man in the forest and the disturbing events of that hike.